Welcome to A Considerate Life. I'm Dr. Jerome Thomas Bridges. Today we're going to be talking about faith and reason, two modes of knowing. Now, we've talked about faith in the past as a theological virtue, and we'll get into that a little bit in the next video. But today we want to focus on faith as a mode of knowing and its relationship and interrelationship with our power of reason. Now, speaking of the power of reason, Joseph Pieper says this in his book, The Four Cardinal Virtues. This is what reason means to Aquinas. And what we'll see is that it's broader than just something like equating reason with science. Reason means to him, to Aquinas, nothing other than regard for and openness to reality. Truth is, to him, nothing other than the unveiling and revelation of reality, both natural and supernatural reality. Now, when we did our talk about Christian mysticism, we saw that from Jacques Maritain, faith was a way of accessing things, truths about God that were unavailable to what we called unaided reason. All right, so now we're going to talk about reason itself, and unaided reason in its three acts. The first act of reason, or the intellect, is called apprehension, or sometimes called simple apprehension. And the product of simple apprehension is concepts. The products are concepts. Get my verbs right there. Concepts are, for a shorthand, we'll just think of concepts as universals. So there are multiple instances of triangles, and triangularity is the concept. There are multiple individual humans, and humanity is the concept. It's the universal that ranges over every individual of that kind. Now, the second act of the intellect is called judgment or existential judgment. Its product are propositions, and this is going to play into the role that propositions play in reasoning, which is the third act. Existential judgment is existential in that it looks at the truth of something. You know, the cat is calico, or something like that. It's taking this object cat and it's predicating of it that it's of a certain color. Now, reasoning is a way of looking at sets of propositions, inferences between them, and then drawing conclusions. And this will make more sense if we sort of build this out. So here's a concept, man. Here's a judgment, Socrates is a man. And then here's an argument, or a reasoning. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? So we're using logic to move through the premises to a conclusion. Logic, a simple definition, is the science of sound reasoning. And when we have a valid logical argument and the premises in our argument are true, then it's what's called a sound argument. Now, keep in mind, the true conclusion, for example, Socrates is mortal, right, is a judgment about Socrates and his mortality, but it's arrived at via the inferences from the argument. So we said this, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That judgment, that final judgment, Socrates is mortal, is not arrived at immediately. It's arrived at mediated through these other two true propositions. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man. The logical necessity of that is that Socrates himself is mortal. So our reasoning ends up at a judgment, Socrates is mortal, and it does it via the inferences from two other true propositions that we already looked at. Now, keep in mind, the truth of an existential judgment is not the same thing. It's not identical to the truth values of propositions as in symbolic logic. So those of you who are familiar with symbolic logic and its truth values, having truth values of propositions in symbolic logic is not the same thing as the truth of an existential judgment. The existential judgment always focuses on or refers to some thing in the world, right? So it's never disconnected from the way the thing exists in the world. Truth values and propositional logic very much can be. Elizabeth Klenk refers to symbolic logic as puzzle solving. It's a lot like math. Now, here you can note the difference between balancing a checkbook and completing an equation. Balancing your checkbook, All the pluses and minuses that go into balancing your checkbook bear on something real in the world, how much money you have in your checking account. You can have all those same numbers and pluses and minuses simply as a mathematical equation, and you can get the same value as a conclusion. But there's very much a difference between solving an equation and knowing how much money you have in your bank account. One is existential, the other is not. And we'll leave aside the constructivist nature of currency not for a discussion on this channel. But reason and rational demonstration. So moving through a series of premises with valid inferences to a conclusion, that's satisfying to the intellect. In the same way as solving a symbolic logic proof or mathematical equation is satisfying to the intellect because the intellect sees very clearly. It sees very clearly every premise. It sees clearly the inferences as we move through the premises, and it sees how we arrived at the conclusion via those inferences. It's very satisfying to the intellect. Now, I say reason is not equal to math and science because there are times, and I've seen this happen often in the past, where when someone wants to take up a discussion of faith and reason, almost immediately the conversation becomes about faith versus science. And that, as a philosopher, that sort of rankles me because reason, as we looked at earlier, is broader than just science and math, right? Philosophical inquiry, historical inquiry, judicial matters, these are things that are not mathematically true, and they're not any part of the sciences, but they're definitely aspects of human reason, right? So reason is not just tightly known as math and science, whatever a rationalist wants to think, and we'll take a look at that later. Now that's a summary of the power of reason, the object of reason, and some of the acts of the intellect, and the nature of logical or rational demonstration itself. Now, what about the nature of faith? Now, the term faith can mean three things, at least. It can be a mode of knowing, which is what we're pursuing here. And as a mode of knowing, it's not belief based on demonstration. It's not seeing how the conclusion is arrived at via the inferences, but it's actually belief based on credible authority, belief based on testimony. So if you've looked at modern epistemology textbooks, you'll look at, some of them will deal with the notion of, or the chain of inferences that take place when it's belief based on testimony. So belief based on testimony, or this mode of faith, is actually extremely common. Most of what we know as human beings, we know based on credible witnesses. If somebody asked me how far the moon is away from the Earth, there's no way I would be able to do that or know that directly. What I would do is I would look up some astrophysics website that's reputable. And I would look up the numbers, and I would say, well, the moon is approximately this far away from the Earth. How do you know that? Well, because the NASA website said that, right? It can also mean a theological virtue, that is, trusting God. We said that these theological virtues have their origin in the Holy Spirit at conversion, and they have their object as God. So faith, hope, and love, the theological virtues. Faith can be known as a theological virtue, which is how we used it last time as a response to cumulative evil. And finally, faith can be a term that means references a body of belief. And this is how we use it when we say the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith. We're talking about the history of that tradition, the beliefs that, sort of the umbrella of beliefs that embody that tradition. So those are at least three ways that the term faith can be used. Here we're isolating number one as a mode of knowing, contrasting it with reason, and then showing the interrelationship between the two. Now, as we've talked about in the past, there's a balanced way of looking at things, and then there are usually at least a couple versions of excess. Rationalism is an excess of the relationship between faith and reason because it's reason alone. So this position holds that we can only say that we truly know something if we can give a rational demonstration for it, that is, evidence and arguments. So typically the way a rational demonstration goes is you have your premises leading to a conclusion. So all men are mortal. Well, how do you know that? Right? So someone might challenge the truth of the premise itself, and then you can marshal evidences for the premise, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Well, how do you know that? Right? And then you can marshal evidences for what Socrates means, what man means, what it means to predicate humanity of Socrates, right? So this is the way we use evidence and argument in rational demonstration. And for the rationalist, we might call the hyper-rationalist, faith is merely blind. It has one meaning, blind belief in some authority that is itself untestable, something like that. So here we have somebody like Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, and he says this: faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. If children were taught to question and think through their beliefs instead of being taught the superior virtue of faith without question, it is a good bet that there will be no suicide bombers. Right? So here, Dawkins is using faith as, number one, it's blind. It's not a valid mode of knowing. Faith is always blind faith. Faith is seen as a virtue, and it's a virtue simply in favor of believing some authority without any other good evidence or arguments. Right? On the other side of the equation, and this is specifically regarding God, knowledge about God, is fideism or fideism, and that is faith alone. And this is also sort of looking at faith both kind of as a means of piety, right, a theological virtue, if you will, but also as a mode of knowing. So this position holds that faith is the only viable means for getting at Christian beliefs, including belief in the existence of God. Faith alone sees God and appropriates truths about God. The intellect is insufficient. The intellect is the pauper here in terms of knowing, and it's insufficient to prove God, so why even bother? Why not just accept God's existence, his nature, his character, his promises on faith? Now, as always, there's a middle ground of the relationship between faith and reason. This is going to get us into what we call either demonstrable or non-demonstrable Christian beliefs. Faith and reason can combine so that the believer can give rational demonstrations for important aspects of the faith, for example, the existence of God and perhaps the historicity of the resurrection. And there are some aspects of the faith, however, that are believed without demonstration, but are believed based on authority, and we'll get to those in a little bit. Now, this clear distinction between faith and reason as modes of knowing, and especially which aspects of Christian belief are demonstrable, that is, we can give evidence and arguments for them, or are non-demonstrable, things that we simply accept because God said so, for lack of a better phrase. This actually emerged from a debate that I had with a client of mine when I was, my undergrad is in exercise and sports science. And so during my doctoral studies, I spent time as a personal trainer, sort of supplementing my student honorarium. And one of the clients I had was a staunch, really intelligent business guy, but he was an agnostic. And so I remember one time, and this was early in my doctoral studies, and I was a younger man with more zeal for debate itself. And we had a running debate the entire hour that I was personal training him. We had a running debate about Christianity, agnosticism, different elements of this. And it got to what we believed about what happens when you die. And I said, look, I can prove to you something about this life after death. And after about 15 minutes of trying my best, I realized, no, I don't have a rational demonstration that we're going to be in heaven with God when we die. The reason I believe that is because I think Jesus clearly says it. Paul says it, and I think they're authoritative in terms of what happens to the human soul when we die. And so I had to kind of go back to the drawing board, because I was so into the process of Christian apologetics that I just simply thought, because everything about Christianity is true, everything about those truths can be rationally demonstrable. And that's just simply not the case. There are some Christian truths that are non-demonstrable. They're things that we accept based on faith or authority. Some of those are God's existence. We can prove that God is the necessary being that grounds all contingent being. We can give arguments for that God is the designer of everything that looks and is designed. And we can give arguments that God is the ultimate ground for objective morals and moral values, right? We could maybe give arguments for objective aesthetic values as well, something like that. And things like the historicity of the resurrection. These are things that we can give historical arguments for. Gabriel Habermas is a big proponent of this. So we can give eyewitness testimony. We can give references to the resurrection from ancient Near Eastern history, and we can give evidences for the resurrection as the thing that started the church. N.T. Wright, in his Resurrection of the Son of God, gives a very compelling argument about the strange and original notion of the resurrection that starts the early church, and how that likely has its origin in an actual historical event. Anyway. Now, I think it's interesting, and I want to pivot to a quotation from Anthony Flew, where he talks about the difference between demonstration and persuasion. He says this: "The attempt to show that there is no philosophical knowledge simply by urging that there is always someone who can be relied on to remain unconvinced is a common fallacy." He says, "I call it the 'but there is always someone who will never agree' diversion." And he goes on, "But the missing piece in this argument is the distinction between producing a proof and persuading a person. A person can be persuaded by an abominable argument and remain unconvinced by one that ought to be accepted." So, again, this is Anthony Flew in his book, There Is a God. Anthony Flew was a philosopher, long-time atheist. Problem of evil was a main problem that he couldn't overcome. And then in the early to mid-2000s, he actually was convinced of, not of Christianity, but of philosophical theism, sort of just a mere theism, based on, I think, the evidence from the computational evidence from genetics and DNA. But Flew makes a good point here, and that is, there's a difference between whether or not we can give a rational demonstration for something, argue or give a proof for something, and whether or not someone is convinced that that proof is valid or convincing or whatever. He says it's the difference between giving a proof and persuading a person. And so the fact that we can give demonstrations for God's existence is true, that we can do that regarding God's existence, regardless of whether or not that proof persuades someone. So we're not talking about whether or not we can persuade someone. We're talking about whether the nature of the subject, God's existence as a ground of morality, things like that, is open to rational debate. Because there are some things about Christianity that they're open for debate, but they're not aspects of things that we believe based on demonstration. Those things are things like the doctrine of the Trinity, that God exists as three persons in one being. The atonement, that when Jesus died, not the historical fact of Jesus' death and resurrection, but that Christ's death and resurrection atoned for humanity's sins and satisfied the Father's justice. And then finally, our personal end, that God desires for us to be with him in heaven when we die, and that those who die apart from Christ go to hell. This is not something that we can know based on demonstration. It's something that we believe based on the authority of Christ and Scripture. Now, moving on to what Aquinas says about faith. He says about things like the Trinity and the afterlife, he says this: "We assent to such matters on the basis of God's truthfulness." So here is Aquinas, very much in the vein of faith as a mode of knowing based on a credible witness. Faith is a type of belief based on authority, namely the authority of God. Now, this is a good note. The evaluation of who or what constitutes a credible authority is itself a judgment of reason. Now, keep in mind, we're just finding a home in the realm of how humans come to believe things. We're finding a home and a middle ground between faith and reason. Now, reason tells us which people or objects or whatever are credible authorities. So, for example, I sat on 3 dissertation panels this semester, and one of the things we do is we look at the footnotes, we look at the bibliography, and if there's somebody quoting primary sources, that's good. David Hume says in Hume's book, On Human Understanding or whatever, rather than David Hume says because I looked it up on Wikipedia, right? One of those, the original writing, is a credible source, and the other one is not so much a credible source. So it's a judgment of reason which authorities are credible authorities. And then once reason has determined, yes, this person, this website, this book is a credible authority, then other things that we believe that come from that authority don't necessarily need to be also based on reason, because reason does have a role in faith as a mode of knowing. So going back to Dawkins, when he says, faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. This is an assumption that faith is simply blind faith, that faith is not a legitimate mode of knowing, and that reason plays no role in determining which sources of testimony that we accept as credible. So there are a variety of mistakes that Dawkins makes in his dismissal of faith. Now, things like the Trinity. The Trinity is a matter of debate, but it's a non-demonstrable Christian belief. So how do we debate matters of faith? Well, Aquinas says that we can do two things. We can give probable reasons for the belief, even though we can't demonstrate it. We can give probable reasons for the belief. And the second part is we can show how objections to the belief fail or are not necessarily true. Right? So here's an example, the Trinity. The Trinity is that we have the Father, the Son, the Spirit. We have three persons in one God. The persons are distinct from one another, but they all share the divine essence. Now here's a probable argument for the Trinity. It makes sense that the Godhood would not be a simple monotheism, but it would include some sort of community, because God is love, and love is mainly an expression of between persons, not just one person in isolation. Is that a demonstration? No. But if somebody says that the Trinity just of itself as an idea doesn't even make sense, well, yeah, it does. It can make sense because one of the key attributes of God is that God is love, and that makes more sense in a community than it does in isolation. Now, showing how an argument against the Trinity fails or is not necessarily true. Somebody might say this, and so many people have said this: God cannot possibly be triune in the way that you say, because that would mean that there is one God and there are three gods. I had a debate with an atheist a long time ago over email, because there was no social media at the time. And this was the sticking point. Well, if the Father's God and Jesus is God and the Spirit is God, that's three gods. You can't possibly be one God. There's three gods. You just named them. So we have to look at the nature of contradiction and non-contradiction. So the law of non-contradiction says that two contradictory things cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense, right? So I can be both a father and a son, but not at the same time and in the same sense. I can be a father to my children, and I can be a son to my parents, right? The doctrine of the Trinity holds that God is one in essence and three in personhood. He's not one in essence and three in essence. That would be a contradiction. He's not one in personhood and three in personhood. That would be a contradiction. He's one in essence and three in personhood. Since essence and personhood are different senses, it does not violate the law of non-contradiction. Now, does the doctrine of the Trinity go beyond reason? Yes. Belief in the Trinity goes beyond reason. We accept that God is triune based on the authority of the Bible, based on the authority of revelation. But it does not contradict reason. It doesn't violate contradiction, but we can't see simply with unaided reason how it is that ultimate reality is one in essence and three in personhood. We just can't see that. It's a mystery. Now, here's an analogy of faith. I actually heard this story from a pastor on the radio many years ago driving through Charlotte, and I thought that is a great way of explaining what Aquinas thinks about in terms of belief based on faith. It is this. One summer, a man was out for a dip in the lake at the end of the day. As the sun was setting, a thick fog descended upon the lake. He was well away from the shore, and he soon lost his sense of direction. As the sun's light was fading and being diffused through the fog, he just simply could not tell where he was. He began to panic. He would strike out in one direction and think, am I swimming toward the shore or am I swimming toward the middle of the lake? Then he would stop and he would strike out in another direction. After half an hour or so, someone came to look for him. They called to him from the shore. He detected where their voice was coming from, and he swam to shore and to safety. That is a great analogy for what Aquinas thinks about in terms of belief based on authority. He says this: other things being equal, sight is better than hearing. That is, seeing why something is true, the intellect, is better than just hearing about it, which is faith. But if the one we're listening to can see more, then hearing gives the better certainty. So when we hear from God, who cannot be mistaken, so what we hear from God, who cannot be mistaken, is much more certain than what we can see by reason, which makes mistakes. So this is a great sort of flip-flop of contemporary intuitions about faith and reason. Reason is certain, but faith is just sort of a guess. You just hope that it's true. This is not the case for Aquinas. For Aquinas, he thinks reason can see. We can see things with the intellect, how we move, but the intellect is fallible. It makes mistakes. God is infallible. God is unerringly correct in everything that he reveals to us. So if we've understood that revelation clearly, then we can be more certain about what God says because he doesn't make mistakes than we can about what we can reason through for ourselves because our reason makes mistakes, right? So that's reason as that's faith as a mode of knowing. But faith is also, as we said, a theological virtue, and it's also can refer to a body of beliefs. So kind of in a stepwise manner, we'll expand this notion of theological virtues. We'll talk about faith as a theological virtue. We've already spoken about that. We'll add hope and love, and we'll rely on Joseph Pieper's book on the theological virtues for these: faith, hope, and love. And we'll talk about them as obediential potencies. So I know you're probably waiting with bated breath about what an obediential potency is. I think it's really interesting. So we'll talk about the nature of faith, hope, and love, and how they function as spiritual obediential potency. We'll do that next time.